Good afternoon. I'm Jane Bowers. I'm the provost of John Jay College. I'd like to thank you all for attending, especially given the fact that we're in the middle of a snowstorm and in the aftermath of what they insist on calling a severe storm as opposed to a hurricane, but it was a hurricane as far as I'm concerned. So I don't know if all of you know John Jay College. I just want to say a word or two about who we are. Our mission is summed up, if you came in through the front, you saw it, as educating for justice. That's what we do. And the members of our community are not only deep thinkers about justice, they are also fierce advocates for justice. Today's topic, obesity in children, very important topic, is being co-sponsored by the New York Obesity Research Center at St. Luke's Hospital and by Grassroots Community Foundation. I'm going to invite to the stage Dr. Marie-Pierre Saint-Onge, and I would also like to introduce her. She is a research associate at New York Obesity Research Center and a professor at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. She is one of the leading national experts on obesity. Dr. Saint-Onge, would you please come up and introduce our faculty member?
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon to introduce the speaker of this symposium, Dr. Janice Johnson-Diaz. Dr. Johnson-Diaz's work, her research focuses on impoverished mothers and children. She specializes in building collaborations dedicated to sustainable social change and worked with a wide array of human services agencies, including educational, employment, and health institutions across the U.S. Over the past couple of years, Dr. Johnson-Diaz has been working with community-based organizations in Memphis and in Long Island, New York. Her work in Long Island on Black girls' mental, sexual, and physical health issues earned the collaborative special congressional honor. More recently, she founded the Grassroots Community Foundation, a health advocacy and giving organization. And this afternoon, we'll hear a little more about the research that they've been working on to help reverse the trends in obesity, HIV/AIDS, breast cancer, and suicide among impoverished women and girls. This afternoon's topic will be focusing on obesity. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Johnson-Diaz.
Hello, everyone. I'm Janice Johnson-Diaz, and I appreciate you being here. I am very, very thankful to St. Luke Hospital and the Obesity Research Center, as well as to John Jay College of Criminal Justice for highlighting the work that I have been doing. In my bio, you will hear that I have a long history now, as I've gotten old, of working on issues related to impoverished women and children and their children. And I come to this work not as a health researcher, but as a person who is deeply interested in the issues of justice and issues of stratification and inequality. And I would come to do research around obesity through those lenses. So I am not going to talk to you about how to calculate your BMI. I'm going to talk to you about an issue, that being obesity, that is an issue of inequality and an issue of the unjust social and economic and political environment that would give rise to why we have this pandemic. So the issue of obesity, we can call it many things, as I've just referred to as a pandemic, but it really is an issue for Black and brown women. So the sciences will tell you that obesity has great problems for our health and our well-being, but it also has a whole host of problems for our economic and political positioning in the world, right? So being obese means that you have a decreased likelihood of marrying someone who's wealthy. It means that you have a decreased likelihood of going to a college if they have a face-to-face interview. So we already have a population who are Black and brown who have challenges, and then we add on top of that obesity that decreases their economic or their political positioning. The first study I'm going to talk to you about, and the study that I'll focus most of my attention, is a research funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Active Living Research, and the New Connections Program. So I have listened to many conversations about obesity, and people, in large part, have come to the conclusion that people are obese because they're fat and lazy. Yeah, that seems so simple. We decided that people who are on welfare, they were on welfare because they were lazy. Lazy seems to be the answer for everything. So I applied for some funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to examine this population of people who are most affected, the Black mothers and their children in inner city. The study's focus was inner city mothers' reluctance to allow their young girls outside to play. Was it indeed related to this neighborhood fear? And I began with the idea that as a good sociologist, one of the things that we know is that neighborhood effects really have an impact on a whole host of things. And we know that it impacts our health, right? So then we have to think about the social processes. So what do I mean by that, right? How do we make sense of the fact that obesity resides with Black and brown women? And so I thought, who best would know the answer than the people themselves? So I went to Newark, and Newark, people will say, I think in 2009 and 2010, it was deemed one of the most dangerous and violent cities in the United States. I started to interview people in Newark, and they said, okay, if you're really interested in how violence might be impacting people's decision-making, you have to go to this place called Georgia King Village. It's a large private development with about 422 apartments. The rents range from roughly $800 to almost $2,000. The majority of the residents are Black, and they are, in great part, single mothers, and they're receiving some housing subsidy. So at the time that I went to study Newark, I had to be brought in with armed security. I went to the gate. The two men with the 9mm walked me in, and I interviewed mothers. I interviewed 33 mothers with daughters 9 to 13, and I focused on 9 to 13 because it was the fastest growing rate of obesity is among this group. They had, on average, 2 children live in their household, which may seem contrary to the popular statements about the fact that poor people seem to want to have 6 kids. But on average, we really still do have only 2 children. Over 60% were single. The majority were born in Newark. They had lived in Georgia King Village for at least 8 years, and they had some college experience and were, in fact, again, contrary to popular belief, some did work. I started by doing semi-structured interviews with 19 mothers, and I kept hearing the same kind of answers to the questions that I would pose about, do you let your daughter outside to play? That was the first question. People were just like, no, why would I do that? I was like, oh, my bad. Okay. Tell me what you know about play. How important is play? Yeah, kids need to play. They're playing inside. I was like, all right. Do you let your daughter outside to play? Nah. Have you seen the neighborhood? Sorry, I did not realize that. So after hearing that 19 times in 75 to 90 minutes, we crafted the first paper out of this work using our question focus analysis. I wanted to find out what was the rationale offered by mothers for keeping their daughters inside, and what was the recommendation. So in my interview guide, I asked mothers an essential question. What would it take for you to let your daughter outside to play? What solutions, if you were talking to Cory Booker, if you were talking to the governor, what solutions do you think are necessary in order to help you facilitate your daughter outside to play? What structural things would have to happen? Because it's not enough to describe their problems. One of the criticisms of sociology is that we are very good at describing the water that people are drowning in. I decided that that was not going to be my research focus. In fact, I would like to know the texture of the water, but I'd also like you to tell me what would it take to help you swim so you can get out of that water. Right? So a part of this first paper, which is published in the journal, is about what recommendations would they have for improving the safety conditions such that they would feel comfortable in letting their daughter out. So here are some of the key findings. The neighborhood problems that prevented daughters' outdoor play were threefold. One is that the neighborhood was just not safe. The violence was predictable, and their neighbors were a part of the problem. Now, I would like you to bear in mind this, and while we may or may not talk about the complexity of this, their neighbors are Black and brown like they are. So embedded in the research around obesity, right, embedded in the conversation is about intraracial animus, right? So we're talking about community members who find the people next to them to be more problematic than they are, the us versus them scenario. So there was this chorus of agreement around mothers that they just simply did not let their daughters outside. They understood that play was important, but it wasn't that important, right? Not relative to keeping their children safe, physically safe. So one of the things that I found in this research was that this notion that they were lazy or they didn't want their babies outside was simply not true. It was not substantiated by this sample of mothers, is that they understood the importance of play, but they had to weigh that against the reality of their children's safety, right? So we're talking about this high level of sequestration that occurs within these neighborhoods. Now, if you can imagine spatially, right, we're talking about small confined spaces, right, where people have made the decisions that once they've entered in, they're going to stay in. So for those who are in the room or interested in child development, we're talking now about the violence outside and the violence within, right? Imagine the agitation of a mother who then does not have the open space in order to let her children outside. I have a 7-year-old. Now, I want to say to you very, very clearly, to any parent who's in here, I'm sure that you will concur. Having your children so close to you with such proximity for multiple hours is enough to make anybody do something crazy, right? So, now, when I asked parents about what was necessary, they said, the first thing you must do if you're interested in health and my children being outside is that we must first establish basic safety. Now, when we talk to people about obesity, right, safety is not typically a part of the conversation. You might hear as a tangent statement, some of these neighborhoods are just not safe. They don't have good access to food. It's just kind of, it just gets passed over as a part of like a small endnote in some conversations, right? But for these mothers, establishing basic safety was an essential feature. I think they needed more police, and mainly in the summertime, because we have people coming from all over. But one mother describes that she feels more safe now. They have 24-hour armed guards. It's just a phone call away. I see it because I work here during the day. The security guards, they're good. They're good. They try to help you the best of their ability. They are big guys, too. They've got guns, so they feel good. So they're good. I feel safe now that we've gotten new security. Now, for John Jay College, for our researchers, this is a particularly important point, right? It's well established, the conflict between police and the Black and brown community. And in this set of conversation, what you hear is mothers, Black mothers, asking for more cops, right? Now, that's a difficult thing to reconcile in some respects because we're talking about issues of racism, hypersurveillance, trust, the history, and the historical relationship. But yet you would hear that one of the things that mothers are asking around health is that if I had more cops, maybe I would be healthier. The second things that mothers said they wanted was they wanted, if they were talking to state and program officials, they wanted more resources for their children. Mothers requested more structured, child-friendly neighborhood programs. Why don't they have anything for the kids to do? They should have things, some programs for the kids to do, they don't. And they're tearing down the basketball court that gave the kids activities. Basketball is a way to lose weight, get some exercise, and they're tearing that down. It's nothing for them to do in here at all. Now, if anyone in here, again, studies child development, we talk about the importance of play. Not structured activity, but free, unstructured play, right? Because play allows you to resolve conflicts, right? So when children go on the playground and they have an opportunity to play together, they have an opportunity to grow, to resolve, to be able to do that. And it is that play that's important. But again, just like the previous example of wanting more police, right? More guardianship. Again, here, mothers are asking for more structure, less of that free play, right? Those things that we would say would be important in terms of developing people over their life course. So we can think about the consequences of this kind of request over the life course, right? What happens if both your home environment is so hyperstructured, your play is hyperstructured, how then do you learn the negotiating skills that may be necessary to thrive in a place like college, like in a place like work, right? The final request that mothers asked, which is a housing question, if there was someone from housing in the room, is that they felt like families needed Georgia, not Georgia King. Georgia King was named after a developer who was from Atlanta who had been deeply influenced by Martin Luther King. They asked for more enclosed housing similar to those in the American South, right? They said the South represented opportunities to develop trust and informal bonds that they didn't think was necessary in the urban space. The quotation I'll read to you really illustrates their ideas. Down South, I would be like, hey, how you doing? And they'd be like, fine, how you doing? And how are you, the kids? But up here, it's like, who is she talking to? I don't know her, she don't know me. You could open your back door or front door and you could be in your house cooking and washing or whatever, and your kids can be out there playing and doing whatever. Here, we can't be in the laundry room upstairs and let our kids be outside playing in the playground. No, you have to be out there with them. So when we think about the kind of hyper-surveillance, the structured spacing, the way in which families, if you live in Newark, or even communities like this, the way in which the surveillance is not just the surveillance of any kind of macro-structural surveillance. We're talking about parental surveillance of their children's actions, right? And how that surveillance plays out not only to the sequestrant inside of the home, right? The potential ramifications for child development, and therefore the consequences as we think about allowing kids outside to play. Now this was the reason. Among all the interviews that I had, mothers were strikingly afraid of young black and brown boys, 14 to 20, right? They felt like they were their opportunity for hope resided in them, but in this moment, what made their neighborhoods unsafe were these black and brown boys, 14 to 20, right? Now, in their conversations about these black and brown boys, they felt like their actions were the actions that dictated their sequestering, the actions that dictated their play, the actions that dictated their governance of their daughters, right? Now, when this occurred for me, when I kept hearing about this fear and the hope, it was at this juncture that I was wrestling with several different things in my life and trying to figure out, as a researcher who'd now gone to Memphis, to Compton, to all of these communities helping to strategize, what was I going to do? Was I going to be this researcher that I'd vowed never to be? The person who came in, I had these findings, I reported them to the city council, the mayor got his report, Robert Wood Johnson got their report. Was that going to be the end of the kind of work I did? And what I found was that the focus on black and brown boys was being done in the context that people understood that if girls and women were not safe, they could not be healthy, right? And that given the context of the United States where black and brown men were so heavily incarcerated and kept in prisons, the people who were left to marshal the neighborhoods, to make sure the neighborhoods grew, were the women and girls. So they were not getting the explicit attention because they weren't doing the externalizing things that so many of us are attracted to. Somebody gets into a fight, we can do something about that. Somebody gets shot, somebody gets robbed. Externalizing behaviors get a lot of our attention. But the internalizing behaviors, the increasing obesity rate, which I would characterize as a form of intrapersonal violence, was getting absolutely no attention. And that as a researcher who would come out of this history of being interested in poor women and girls, that was where my attention was going to be focused. And that we needed to move away from the externalizing behaviors and start thinking about different forms or different configurations, right? The paper that I've started to craft is to think about how obesity, much like drug abuse, could be another form of what I've just said, intrapersonal violence. So what was I going to do, right? I decided that I was going to move away from the conversation about obesity. People love to talk about obesity, and people who often talk about obesity are not thinking about health. I'd understood through this process that health was really crucial if you were interested in justice, and that we needed to have a broader focus around health and its intersection with obesity, but to see the framework as different. And none of the research had thought about how we were going to make the messaging of what we are learning real to the people who feel and experience it, right? We now have a great name for it. We call it translational knowledge, but we hadn't done that. And it was that gave rise to the Grassroots Community Foundation. And so we came up with a very bold mission. And the bold mission is to create a world where all girls grow up to be healthy women. Because we understood that if these community of women were not safe, they were not healthy, then what we had conceived of as a society was simply just not going to be. So when we legislate policies, if we were to write a policy today around crime, right, and we wanted to make sure that we were going to find a way to reduce crime, the intermediaries, the people who exact the policies, are often community-based organizations. And we need to better educate them and provide them with kind of assistance to tell them, right, about this grave condition that we have happening. that they need to now pay some attention to. So what do you do if you're a community-based organization who's been doing like work around sexuality? Like, why should I care about obesity? Because it turns out overweight girls, particularly white girls, are more likely to engage in risky sex behavior. So this issue that seemingly is unrelated to everything, right, is in fact the nexus issue. This is how you would get a researcher like me interested in obesity. Because we begin to find the linchpin issues. If you're interested in notions of justice, you must consider obesity and its attendant causes. So to raise this awareness, these are the core principles, is that we educate communities. So I have most of these conversations I don't have with people sitting in such a pretty room. I'm usually talking to real people on the ground about what is going on with poor women and girls, what's happening with our health. So we fund projects by giving them roughly between $10,000 to $15,000 and 4 staff. So they get a site manager, right? They get an organizational specialist. They get a curriculum specialist so that they can codify what they do. So in Philadelphia, we fund this after-school program, and the features of the programs are such, is that they're offered a healthy eat-in, which we collaborate with Drexel University for that. There is a curriculum developed around self-esteem. The children are given, and their families, weight training. Last year it was aquatics, this year it's yoga. And each of our programs have financial literacy. In Newark, we now have 3 programs, and one is an after-school for high school kids, but this is probably my favorite of all the programs, called HEAL. When I interviewed people in Newark, and I said, well, do you know about the First Lady's Initiative? Let's move. And they were like, yeah, let's move the hell out of Newark, right? And it was in that process that HEAL was born. I started to share with some folks I was working at St. Matthew's Church in Orange about the fact that yoga may be a great way in light of things to actually help inner city youth reduce their stress level and become more focused in school, and the data had borne true. So in all of that, I'm gonna wrap up in a few seconds, is that what I would like to say is that the work born out of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation work left so many unanswered questions that for a researcher like me who's interested in notions of justice, the question is then how do you take that knowledge and actually be able to translate in a way that would move us towards a more just society? I want to thank you for your time. I know we're going to talk for a few minutes, and I welcome all your questions.
Initially, I was wondering, okay, well, what about the food deserts? And you touched upon that, but how much are families concerned about that? They're concerned a lot about their safety, is what you reported, but are they concerned about the food environment as well? And what does it mean when individuals don't feel safe in their neighborhoods and with the high crime levels? What does it mean in terms of their nutrition and how they can?
Yeah, so I think families don't care about obesity. Obesity is something that researchers, maybe the First Lady, maybe you and I care about, right? They have no interest in that. They have some interest, and they're primarily interested in seeing that their children are alive, and by their definitions, well. And well means that they're happy, that they've listened to their teachers, they've listened to their parents. So I think that there are some solutions that are out there. Again, the issue of dissemination. So Robert Wood Johnson Foundation with Tony Yancey has developed this thing called 10-minute recess. And 10-minute recess, so the research on kids' movement says that kids, if they're allotted 30 minutes of play, what they do is they play for the first 10 minutes and then they just stop moving, right? And you see, if you watch a playground, you will see that this is mimicked. Like they go hard at the beginning, and then they just kind of chill and hang out, right? So Tony Yancey, having observed this, developed 10-minute recess. And 10-minute recess is a physical activity break that can be done within any space, in any kind of clothing that educators can use in the classroom. Each of those 10 minutes add up to more movement and better heart rate, but also greater concentration, because we know that the returns post-physical activity are really good for the brain. The United States mandates people's participation in one core institution, schools, right? It mandates it, right? It says that if you don't send your kids to school, you can be fined, you can be made a criminal, right? So as we think about getting the biggest bang for our buck, we have to think about the policies in and around schools, whether it is this elementary school environment as well as the middle and high schools. And certainly, I have talked, and my students here, they've done research on the food environment in their neighborhoods in John Jay and around John Jay. Because we are a Hispanic serving institution, this issue is central to our student body, is that the issue of justice around food becomes crucial. And I think that we are primed for developing policies that are attached to the educational space. And my hope is that enough researchers will start to engage in translational work so we can break down the space between the community and our academic knowledge.
Do you have any thoughts on how to facilitate that? Because, you know, as a clinical researcher, and all of my colleagues at the New York Obesity Research Center, we do a lot of clinical research.
I think that as we do our research, clinical research, sociological research, we must begin with the end in mind, right? Stephen Covey talks about that in The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? If we do not think about what do I do this research for what end, right? And I think the end is justice. Right? We do this research in the name of justice, then I think the questions we will ask and where we will disseminate our work will be varied as opposed to the way it is right now.
It's interesting that you mentioned earlier about survival for, you know, how the parents want their kids to survive. Well, our students here at John Jay College are on a survival mode. They're surviving, they're busy. I got to get to work, Mr. Jackson. I got to make money. I got to get my Metro card. I got to do this, this, and this. And they forsake their health. They forsake their eating habits. And, you know, as it starts as an 8-year-old, you know, girl, 10 years later at 18, 19, 20 years of age, some of the problems that you mentioned in your study are still occurring when they're young adults.
Yeah, so what we have decided around health is that it is the other thing. I'll pay attention to it soon, right? It is not seen. Again, I think that this is an issue of what have we decided are our core priorities? And health doesn't seem to be the engine that fuels us. I can get to health. I can get there some other time, some next day. Right? I don't need to be healthy. So if we look at, for example, and I say this all the time, if we look at just the black leadership across the United States, we're talking about well-being, economic returns. We're looking at people who do not look like health ambassadors, who have demonstrated they're not ambassadors. We look at our own leadership across all racial schemes, right? Is that health, they don't need to be healthy. This is why I think a tremendous amount of attention has to go to the elementary school, right? Because we have to begin to start this as a part of the natural process that health matters every day, not to just tomorrow.
That's a nice closing remark. Thank you.
Thank you all.